I'd like to welcome Liam McKenna on his webinar on Value is the Eye of the Beholder. Liam McKenna leads the Asset Management Programme across Defence Infrastructure and is also a very active member of the IM, sitting on the Professional Development Committee. I'll just hand over to Liam. At the end of the session, will be an opportunity for any questions and open discussion. If you can put any questions that you have into the question section on the side, and we'll try and feed as many of those questions through to Liam at the end of the session. Over to you, Liam. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rob. Welcome all. It's afternoon here in the UK. I'm sure some of you it will be late evening or early morning, but hopefully you will find this of interest. So as Rob has mentioned, my name's Liam McKenna. I work for the UK Ministry of Defence's Infrastructure Asset Management Programme. And I'd like to thank the Institute of Asset Management for inviting me along today to share some of my thoughts and also promote a discussion around value. So I've been working in asset intensive organisations for some 30 years now, and have developed various asset management skills along the way. But predominantly my background was in maritime and also some infrastructure operations. And I've spent several years as an asset management director, and I've led 4 significant asset management programs globally. I'm a qualified marine engineer and marine surveyor, which means I've got a deep interest in this subject matter. And as Rob mentioned earlier, I'm an active member of the IAM and assist in various groups as a volunteer. Some of the images around here, some are serious, some are less so. Probably the one in the bottom right-hand corner, you're all wondering what the heck that's all about. Well, am I a jester or am I a juggler? And this is for you to choose at the end. But as I go through the scale of the endeavour that I'm involved in, I'm sure some of you will realise that you have to be both in this world. Probably more juggler than jester, but let's see. And before I go into the presentation, I've got to put out a health warning. Clearly, the organisation I work for, there's a lot of sensitivity in the subject matter. So I've had to desensitize quite a bit of the examples and some of the discussion points. So please forgive me if I'm not unable to answer specific questions. This is probably because the answer is too sensitive and I'm not able to share it with you. Next slide, please. So what do we mean by value? It can be many things, including economic value, intrinsic value, subjective value. Is through, we each have different lenses on value. We all come from different cultures, so there's a cultural value. Environmental values. In today's environment, in today's world, we've got the climate emergency, and environmental issues are a major concern. Personal value, what we hold dear to ourselves, what really matters to us. The customer value, what the customer wants, what is their value proposition. Social value and utilitarian value and time value are all really important stuff. So in summary, value is a versatile and context-dependent concept that can have economic, ethical, cultural and personal dimensions. It's often subjective and it's a relative concept, and its interpretation can be widely based on individual perspectives and societal norms. But what does it mean in asset management terms? Next slide, please. So as I mentioned earlier on, a large part of my background has been in the infrastructure, in maritime infrastructure. And I worked with cruise ships for quite a few years. And this particular scenario, some of you will have seen it before, but I think it really does present a fantastic example of how value really does matter. So in the top left-hand corner, from an operational perspective, from an operational perspective, what does the business, what does the organization perceive as being of value? Well, invariably a cruise operator will spend a great deal of time worrying about the technical aspects and elements of its operation. It will be very concerned about the propulsion units that it uses to drive these ships through the water. But there are 5 or 6 engines in a cruise ship. They generate power for all of the onboard systems. If 1 or 2 of those were to break down, the passengers on board aren't going to understand or appreciate the fact that they've broken down, because all of the systems carry on operating as they should. There's that level of redundancy has been built in. But from an operator's perspective, there's a great deal of concern, effort, and money put into ensuring that these engines do not break down. And there's fantastic life cycle plans in place also to ensure that that happens. And then from a safety perspective, what about the lifeboats? Well, if one of the lifeboats were to fail, and during its annual maintenance, the passengers wouldn't necessarily understand that, nor would they be that concerned, nor would they necessarily know about it. However, if it was on the hotel services side of the operation, such as a lift or a drinks dispenser, a toilet, or indeed a laundrette, then clearly the passengers, I think, would start to be concerned, because that's part of their value proposition. And what we saw in the cruise industry is actually, when you looked at the customer satisfaction questionnaires, they didn't talk about engines failing or the lifeboat not operating as it should. They did talk about the hotel operation. They talked about the drinks dispensers, the lifts. And if people saw out of order notices on these, for whatever reason, they automatically started to think that the maintenance on board the ship was poor. So they then started to draw conclusions from that. So invariably, when we looked at these questionnaires, they were the highest scoring items. Very rarely would we see the fact that the engine had broken down. That just didn't feature. It wasn't part of the value proposition that a customer will be looking for. So we decided to look at the washing machines, and we only did this because we were asset managers. We were looking at the entire holistic offering that was there. And what we saw very immediately was there's a great story in this about how asset management could improve the overall value proposition for the organization. On average, this particular fleet of vessels were about 18 years old, as was their white goods. Was there a life cycle replacement plan in place for the white goods? No. Yet I'd challenge every one of you, if you have, and almost certainly you will have white goods at home, your washing machine or your fridge or your tumble dryer, you've probably replaced them within the last 5, 6, maybe maximum 10 years. But here we were operating washing machines that were 18 years old. No wonder they were breaking down. No wonder we were spending so much time in maintaining them. And actually, when we started to look at it, we were spending a lot of time maintaining them, a lot of effort. And the reason being because actually most of the parts that went with these machines were obsolete. So we decided, right, we needed to replace these. We needed to do something urgently. We needed to install a life cycle management plan for these units. And we went out to market and we secured a contract with a service provider to replace the entire fleet. And we did so in short order. As soon as we had done that, all of a sudden we found that we had extra resource emerging on board the ships. So our technical team was all of a sudden less stressed. And the reason it was less stressed is because the 2 or 3 people had been involved in chasing their tails, trying to keep these washing machines up and running, were now released back into the technical team to look after the more important things, such as the engines and the lifeboats. So the knock-on effect of addressing the failure rate of these machines is we identified that there was a far better way of managing these. And in so doing, we were able to up the number of people within the technical team to look after the core services as well. So we ended up with a plug-and-play approach to our white goods, whereby they were warranted for 5 years. We had a plug-and-play strategy whereby if they failed, they would be replaced immediately under the warranty scheme. We wouldn't try and fix them unless it was just a filter or something simple. And we strategically located spare assets around the world so that the cruise ships, if they did have a problem, they could go in and pick up a new one at no cost. All of a sudden, we saw our customer satisfaction questionnaires improve. And we then started to apply the same philosophy to other assets across the ship. And we were only able to do this because we started to understand that the value is actually really in the eye of the beholder. And this asset management enabled, the asset management approach that we took enabled improvements across the entire operational expenditure of the vessel, which was fantastic. So now I want to go on to more specifics about the organisation I work for. So if we could have the next slide, please. So let's look at the UK's Ministry of Defence. So it's one of the most complex, asset-intensive, large-scale critical infrastructure organisations in Europe, with about 1.4% of the UK's land mass being owned and operated by the UK's MOD. We have somewhere in the region of 132,000 level 2 assets, 35 million square meters of built assets, and our utilities bill is somewhere in excess of £1 million a day. The organisation is only just starting to recognise the advantages of an asset management approach, and that's the role of my team and I. Our role is to drive and improve asset management capability across the organisation. Next slide, please. So the program that I lead was established in 2020, and very early on, we recognised the importance of value and what it meant to the organisation. And the best way of tackling that for us was to ensure that we had a benefits-led program. And so everything that we did was led by what value could we derive from our assets for our customers. Next slide, please. So firstly, apologies for the acronyms that you will see these slides are littered with. Unfortunately, working for the Ministry of Defence and as a civil servant, acronyms is our stock in trade. As I mentioned earlier on, we had to ensure that we had stakeholder engagement very early on, and we had to understand what they wanted from the system. We also wanted to have a really good, engaging and recognizable narrative, a compelling narrative with them. So what we decided to do was create a picture postcard from the future and send it to ourselves. And this is that picture postcard. What can asset management do for our organization? What value will it bring to all of our stakeholder community? And at the end of the day, it's all about those who live, work and train on the estate and how they will benefit from our endeavours. And whether that be the soldiers' families who have to have a safe and secure roof over their head, or a new recruit being able to have a hot shower in the morning, or a jet being able to land on a runway. All of those things need to be considered, and we've got to understand those values. Next slide, please. So, as I mentioned earlier on, the program was born with a view to driving asset management maturity to a competent level by 2025. It is structured around the 6-box model and is informed by maturity assessments, pointing to areas where improvements are required or recommended. For the first couple of years of the program, we benefited from support from industry partners, but for the last 12 months, we've been flying solo. And it's putting us under a great deal of pressure at the moment. But value is a very prevailing discussion point. It seems to be one of the most challenging points that we have within the program. And we're constantly having to address that and work out how best to describe value to our stakeholders. Some of the key products and capabilities that we're developing within the program are scattered around the outside of this image. And again, apologies for the acronyms, but we recently built our strategic asset management plan, which is held at a high level within our organization, so within military headquarters. And we built an asset management framework that supports that, and I'll show more of that in a second. More specifically, we've had to look at how we use a common codification system and a common naming convention right across the organization. So having such a large estate and such a challenging operating environment, ensuring that we're all speaking with a common lexicon, whether that be through our data or actually verbally face-to-face, we need to make sure that we've got that established very early on. We also needed to understand what the organization wanted from its assets, not just in terms of value, but also what other requirements do we have in terms of data or analysis or risk profiling. So very early on, we've had to establish our organizational information requirements and our asset information requirements, and we're working through those at the moment. And we're now introducing an asset class management approach to the way that we manage our assets across the estate. And we have somewhere in the region of 29 asset classes. And an asset class is a collection of level 2 assets that share common attributes or performance expectations. And this new initiative is really starting to gather pace, and the organization is starting to see value from that. Next slide, please. I said I'd mention very briefly the asset management framework, and this is designed to provide a correlation between our infrastructure business artifacts and the ISO 55000 standards artifacts, which define the asset management approach that is being adopted across defence. So it's being used primarily as a directional tool when seeking to identify defence infrastructure policies, plans, processes, information, systems, and people. And this ultimately will deliver asset management and asset management value across the estate. Next slide, please. So asset management is defined by 55000 as being the coordinated activity of an organisation to realise value from its assets. But what does that look like at the simplest level? It means an organisation is making the best decisions it can about its assets based on a clear understanding of its long-term objectives and purpose. Asset management is a discipline that seeks to achieve this, and we need to look at what that involves. So traditionally, asset decisions were bound to the life cycle of an asset in question, from its initial creation through to its working life and to its eventual disposal. And these are not straightforward decisions. For example, how do you build a cost-effective maintenance into the initial design? And how do you measure the criticality of this asset for the rest of your portfolio? And how can you be sure that you even need the asset to begin with? This is an amazing challenge for us because some of our assets are over 400 years old. Some of them are brand new. Some of them are expected to last another 200, 300 years. So we face a significant challenge around understanding the value. If I could ask you to go to the next slide, please. So it's not just about understanding the scale of the endeavour, the scale of the enterprise, the number of the stakeholders, but it's all of those non-standard values as well. So the challenges we've got ahead of us, we need to understand how the value is going to be delivered. We need to understand how to bring together the views and contributions of different activities to maximise their value. We need to manage internal competition for resources and for the people to support this endeavour. We need to develop rules for decisions based on risk and tolerability and grab those opportunities for enhancement. And we need to understand how we can thoroughly integrate assets into the value chain and thus overcoming frequently held views that assets are an overhead or somehow ancillary to the enterprise rather than a core contributor to the organizational value. Next slide, please. So ISO 55000 defines an asset as an item, thing, or entity that has a potential or actual value to an organization. So realization of value will normally involve balancing cost, risk, and opportunities and performance benefits. And the term activity has a broad meaning and can include, for example, the approach, the planning, the plans, and the implementation. Whilst we have numerous tools and models, we, like most organizations, are struggling with three influences on value, risk, sustainability, and intangibles. The Shamrock diagram in the middle was developed by the European Macro Project, and it reveals how any combination of typical business drivers can be qualified in terms of asset value through 5 specific methods. I had some difficulty with this because from our perspective, one of the real values that we need within our organization is military capability. And I couldn't see where capability sat within this tool. But these are some of the tools that we've considered previously. So next slide, please. We've started to focus on a particular approach, and this is a value framework. The Government Construction Innovation Hub, which has subsequently been taken over by the Infrastructure Policy Authority, has developed a value toolkit which looked at the 6 capitals approach, the multi-capitals. What we've done is we've taken that multi-capital approach and we've built up buckets of value to support our decision-making activity. And we've called this the value framework. So we've adopted this approach to value and incorporated it within our infrastructure control framework, which is our strategic asset management plan for the organization. And the concept of value is more about the traditional trade-offs between performance, cost, and time. So it's usually expressed within asset management systems in the form of this value framework. There is a need for a single value framework across our enterprise. And so in order to build it, we've had to collaborate with a vast range of MOD stakeholders, both our industry partners and our top-level budget holders and frontline commands, to ensure that we capture the right identification, organization, and communication, and whole life outcomes across the portfolios and programs that are running within the organization. And this has been very challenging. But at the end of the day, this is starting to articulate the value categories that must be considered when making our investment decisions. So the value framework policy sets out the principles, target, and objectives for each value category. And in making investment decisions, our colleagues must comply with the policy principles across all value categories. But they do have the freedom to determine how to meet the value targets placed upon them across their range of projects. And that's quite difficult. And for the organization, we have a delegated budget model, which means that I don't hold the purse strings. Each one of our frontline commands holds their own purse strings. But what we're trying to do is give them a best practice approach to the way that they can determine value from their assets. So this approach is going to provide us with a repeatable, consistent approach to value-driven decisions, and it will enable our colleagues to optimize how they balance the cost, performance, and risk across their asset base. In the bottom right-hand corner of this diagram is the value pyramid framework. That's a concept that's being floated by the IAM at the moment. And this certainly helps us in our endeavor as it looks at how value is perceived differently and is an inclusive representation of diverse stakeholders. And these must all be engaged in order to ensure that we take on board the end customers, the focal point. And that's why we've got this value pyramid. So there's a white paper out for members consultation at the moment, and I do commend it to you. Please do spend some time reviewing that. So of course, none of this can happen without the stakeholder community actively understanding the principles of asset management. So as part of our mission, if I could ask you to go to the next slide, please. The program has spent a great deal of effort in building the right capabilities within the organization to take asset management forward. And we've done this by some of the following that you see on this slide. So we've developed a competency framework in conjunction and collaboration with the IAM. We've developed bespoke reference material to support our colleagues. We now have a self-assessment tool looking at how competencies are matched across the organization, what skills everybody needs. We run lunch and learn sessions. We've recently established our own foundation and certificate management course, again, in conjunction with the IAM. So we're very much investing in our people to ensure that they can understand how we derive value from our assets and how we take that forward. And lastly, not least, if I could ask to go for the next slide, please. I'm blessed by having a fantastic team. This is the core team, but we have at least 150 active ambassadors from across defence and our supply chain who are committed to driving asset management capability forward and who understand how important understanding value is within the asset management system. Next slide, please. So that concludes my presentation. I've given you a very brief insight into how we are addressing value and how value is perceived differently by everybody. We're by no means perfect and certainly haven't got the ideal approach nailed down as yet. But I would really be keen to understand from you your thoughts on the approach we've taken so far, and maybe some of you wish to share your experiences with us. So thank you for listening, and I'm now more than happy to take any questions that you might have. Thank you. Thanks, Rob.
Thank you very much for that very informative webinar there, Liam. Also, just to let everybody else know that is on this particular webinar, Liam will also be presenting at the UK Chapter Conference in November, so and on a slightly different subject. So if you're able to attend, then please do. Right, going over to questions. So far we have one question in there. Whilst we answer that question, if anybody else now that the main presentation is finished, gather your thoughts and pop a question in there, and we'll see what Liam has to advise. So the question that we've got so far, and this is from Harshad, how are the MOD evaluating the realization of value?
So we have as I mentioned at the outset of the presentation, we spent a great deal of time establishing a benefits map for the organisation, and we had each one of the key stakeholder representatives sign up to that benefits map, so we can clearly link in all of the activities of the programme to delivering those benefits. Within that, we've also been looking at cost, performance and risk, and understanding the criticality of our assets, and we employ various methods for doing that. And obviously I can't share all of that with you, but there are standard methodologies that can be applied, and we use most of those, but they are all heavily reliant upon data, and we have to make sure that data is flowing through the system and that the data that we're pulling in is the right data of the right quality in order to inform those decisions. And in doing that, we then can describe the value of those assets to the organization. Yeah. Would you like me to expand upon that further, Rob?
Yes, in light of we don't have any other questions, you can feel free to expand on that one. We have the time.
Okay, so the our asset base, as I said, is quite significant, with over 132,000 level 2 assets, and they will range from anything from a standard house, and we have somewhere in the region of 50,000 houses across the estate, to an airfield. We've got 30 odd airfields in the UK alone. We have to, the organisation has to understand what information we need to derive from those assets in order to make informed decisions. So in light of the new standard ISO, in light of the revised ISO 19650 guidance on BIM and what comprises of an asset information requirements, we're now going back to each one of our assets through our industry partners to understand what information we need to pull from those assets in order to have the data so that we can make those balance of investment decisions going forward. And that all feeds into the value framework that we have been describing earlier. Yeah.
Okay. We do have some more questions. How does real life experience feed back into the asset management system?
As I mentioned earlier, we have somewhere in the region of 150 active ambassadors who are engaged in working groups and focus groups within the programme. And that they represent all of our stakeholder community, including our industry partners. A large proportion of the maintenance that is carried out on our assets is carried out by those industry partners. So we're working very closely through various alliance working groups and focus groups to ensure that we can benefit from their experiences in how they have maintained those assets, either for other organisations or for us in previous years. And so we're constantly reviewing the lessons learned from those experiences and building them into future strategies. So I mentioned earlier on, we're developing asset class management standards, and those asset class management standards will lay out an idealized intervention plan for each one of our asset classes. So we will be describing the performance expectations, the various mitigations that we believe need to be put in place in order to derive best value from our assets. All of that, those standards are being informed by lessons learned from the SMEs within the business, and also our industry partners, and of course the end user as well. So it's a constant dialogue with our stakeholder community, making sure that we capture all the salient information, and once we've captured it, then building it into our forward-looking plans and into this standard approach that we wish everybody to take forward. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. We have at least one more. We may have more come through after this. Someone's asked, how well was this received from a human culture or form of change management standpoint within the Ministry of Defence?
So I would have to say that at this current moment in time, many of my colleagues, certainly my uniform colleagues, are focusing their efforts elsewhere across the globe because of what is happening. But in order for them to operate effectively, they have to have a robust infrastructure platform that they can rely upon. So ensuring that we had that benefits approach established early on, and that we had the key stakeholder representatives signing up to that. So our frontline commands all signed up to the approach that we were taking. That has really ensured that we are leading from the top and leading by example. We have a vast range of communication methods that we use for reaching out across the organisation. We're holding regular lunch and learns, training events, and we're establishing a groundswell now that recognises the advantages of asset management and what it can bring to the organisation. There have been some speed bumps along the way, absolutely, with fiscal measures that are currently in place as a result of COVID, and as I say, with some of my colleagues focusing their efforts elsewhere in the world. But we are keeping to the program. We're delivering it. We're also able to prove that we are adding value to the organization. We're carrying out regular asset management maturity assessments, which shows that the needle is twitching, and we're taking the organization from a position where it was considered to be naive towards one where we're considered to be competent. And we're certainly seeing that happen. And in order to ensure that and demonstrate that that's the case, we are offering up quick wins along the way. So we've identified specific opportunities that have a large impact across the organization. And we're using those to demonstrate the value of asset management to our colleagues, picking in on focused areas. For instance, one which has been in the news recently within the UK is the condition of the housing offering that we have for our colleagues across the estate. And most of our housing is quite old. It was built in a time where sustainability wasn't a consideration, nor indeed climate emergency was not wasn't even on the radar back then. We're having to go back in now and put all of that right. So there is a very visible example of the improvements that we're making, the way that we're investing in that accommodation to improve the environment for those who live, work and train on the estate. Yeah. Anything else, Rob?
No, that appears to be it for the questions for now. If anyone does have any questions they'd like to field and they think of them afterwards, we can always forward them on to Liam. He can field them offline. We can always put those answers alongside the recording of the webinar. So it just remains to say thank you very much to Liam for again sharing your wealth of knowledge and experience in asset management and for taking part in our webinar series. Thank you very much. Like we say, this will be available online in the next few days for anybody that has missed on this particular session, and you'll be able to see Liam again at the UK conference where he'll be speaking for us in November. Thank you very much, Liam.
Thank you, Rob. Thank you all. Enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you.
Thank you.